Hello, world. This is the Know Your Place podcast, and this is Charles Altendorf. On this week's episode, I'm going to talk about the geography of fried chicken, or at least fried chicken chains. Stay tuned. Hello, everyone. This is Know Your Place podcast. I'm Charles Altendorf. On this week's episode, I wanted to talk about the origins of a few fried chicken chains in the United States. All of these chains now, I believe, are international, so they've obviously become a big deal. And why I think this is very interesting is sort of how the regional differences between them and how they've managed to take them and become international. And so the three I'm going to begin talking about are Kentucky Fried Chicken, Chick-fil-A, and Popeyes. And then maybe if I have time, I'll touch on some other ones. So what people don't understand, what a lot of people don't know is sort of the stories behind these chains. So if we start talking about Kentucky Fried Chicken, everybody obviously knows the Colonel Sanders references, right? But the reason why it's been so long since he's passed on, because he passed on in the 80s. I think a lot of people don't remember his life and what he was really like. So basically, Colonel Sanders was kind of a guy who was a deadbeat guy working around trying to find some kind of job during the Great Depression in the 30s, and landed in not middle of nowhere, Kentucky. London, Kentucky is halfway between Lexington and Nashville, Tennessee, kind of a little more towards the Lexington end. And while it's not quite as fully in the mountains as some other parts of Kentucky, it's on the edge of the mountains. And it's sort of always been a place, though, that people pass through to get from one place to another. So Colonel Sanders, back then he was just, Fred Sanders, decided to open a sort of roadside restaurant, and it was called the Sanders Cafe. And there is a monument to it still there in London. You can go visit. Me and my wife and my friend did when I was in college. And he just opened a roadside restaurant, and that's sort of the story behind these I call them original fried chicken chains, is that they're not, they didn't start out as attempting to be chain restaurants. Like, they really started out as diners. And in fact, a lot of people don't know that the idea for McDonald's and sort of that model, Ray Kroc actually bought sort of a lot of the idea and mindset off of these people called the McDonald's who lived in California who ran a diner. So I think it's easy to think today, because we're now talking, at least 60 years removed from when any of these chains started, to think of these as like set up like they are today. But back in the day, they were just these little diners, and people with little ideas. Anyway, so back to Colonel Sanders. So he had this roadside dinner in London, Kentucky, and he said, and back then, fried chicken used to be a really laborious food to cook, because it took a lot of effort. Well, he said, hey, what if I could cut the speed down on cooking it? And he decided to, and I know because I used to work in fried chicken, and I used to work for Chick-fil-A, and I'll talk about that later on here. So what if I could just put that in a pressure cooker and have these out in like 10 minutes? And, then I could mass produce this and sell it. Well, sure enough, his idea became brilliant, and what he did was he just sold franchises and came up with a special recipe of herbs and spices, that's what they go on about, for his fried chicken, and went around and sold these franchises, and it just ballooned from there. But I think people don't realize that they were the original chain. So a lot of people, when we look back on eating fried chicken now, at least people like me who live in Kentucky, we see them as a throwback, And so it's very interesting for me to see. I meet a lot of international people through various things, and they instantly identify that with Kentucky or the United States, and they say, "Oh, well, that's what it epitomizes." And to us, it's like a throwback, like a big throwback, like. Not to say that I don't eat KFC, but I don't eat it as often as I eat other things, and it's because it was the original. It is the first big name in fried chicken that became a national chain. You know. Anyway, so Colonel Sanders, his places were growing, and I would say again that they're probably the biggest and most successful. And they're in league with Taco Bell and Pizza Hut. But the next one I'm going to talk about, I actually worked for, and sort of a little bit after Colonel Sanders and the Kentucky Fried Chicken boomed in the 70s, and this was something called was a chain called Chick-fil-A came online, and people don't know the story behind that very much either. And of course, I know this because I was indoctrinated in the training videos. But there, like Colonel Sanders, the guy who started Chick-fil-A, Truett Cathy, also ran a diner. His was in Atlanta, Georgia, and he served fried chicken. And he said, "How can I make this into a quick sandwich that people can eat on their lunch?" And that's how he came up with his sort of fried chicken with the pickle sandwich. And and then his big entry into things was, unlike Colonel Sanders, who sold franchises to people, he tried to get his restaurants in malls, because he saw that, back before the 70s in America, there weren't a lot of malls, and malls were built a lot in the 70s and 80s. So he would try and get in the food courts of all these malls that would open up, especially in the South. And that really took off. I mean, they've become a household name, and now they have a bunch of freestanding restaurants, of course, and a much wider menu. But that really took off, and I mean, for several years, that was just their business, was being in malls and the food courts and selling chicken and French fries, and selling these sandwiches and French fries. So, and you see kind of the differences in both menus, right? So, if you look at KFC again, because they're the original, they're more oriented towards a whole family meal than anybody else. I mean, all of them have them, but they had the original thing with the bucket, right? And you get your how many pieces of chicken, and you get your sides, and they had corn and green beans, and they have mac, but they're more famous for the mashed potatoes. Whereas if you look at Chick-fil-A, they're geared toward the lunch worker, right? They just had a sandwich or fries, and you can order these platter trays, but they don't and they do have some kind of way to order a family meal, but it's not the same thing. Like, they're geared towards almost the guy who's on their break from the the now 8 to 5 working day, right? And they're having their lunch break, whereas KFC was geared towards the family dinner. And you can see, I mean, there's references to it in all kinds of shows with KFC. People don't often reference Chick-fil-A, but like you look at a show like that 70s show, I remember made a reference to it once, and it's just kind of funny, it's hilarious to me seeing sort of like this is what people stereotype fried chicken as. And, I would say both the owners were kind of clean-cut guys, although Truett Cathy, obviously, if anybody knows anything about him, he is a very clean-cut guy, has very clean-cut values, and when I was working there, they always emphasized going the extra mile, being very friendly with the customers, and things like that. So, so that's sort of what Chick-fil-A's model was. So if Chick-fil-A and KFC are kind of two of the older chains, one that's a little bit older too is Popeyes. And what makes Popeyes so much more unique is where it's from, first of all. Being out of New Orleans, you're just going to get a wider variety of stuff, right? And that's why they call it Louisiana Fast, and they got all these different kinds of things on the menu, gumbo and stuff, right? And it was started by a guy named Al Copeland, who recently passed away a few years ago. And he originally tried to open a restaurant like KFC. He wanted to compete with Colonel Sanders, and it flopped. You know why it flopped? Because it wasn't different enough, right? So then he sat around and he thought a bit, well, I'll make my chicken the spiciest. And then it sold a lot faster. But he was a very interesting story, because if we sort of talk about Colonel Sanders being just a friendly old grandpa who dressed like that for 20 years after it became popular, or Truett Cathy being, again, the conservative, clean-cut guy, then Al Copeland was the opposite of that. He grew up poor in working-class New Orleans. So when he finally made some money off of this venture, and he also owned a bunch of elegant restaurants too. He owned a lot of restaurants. He was very influential in the food industry in New Orleans, from what I understand. And he just flamboyant, man. He would go rolling around with lots of different women, buying speedboats, just acting very flashy in public. Kind of the way I don't know if we would say, I guess for the way we would kind of refer to Kanye today, but a little different because Kanye didn't start off as poor as Al Copeland, but it's a similar kind of thing. Rolling around, just being very flamboyant and whatever. And people in New Orleans loved him for that, because that's the kind of that's the kind of thing they like in New Orleans. And flamboyant person with and it comes out in his restaurant. I don't know how many of you have had Popeyes. I've had it a few times. It's a different atmosphere to sort of the older atmosphere of like a KFC or Chick-fil-A, right? I mean, although Chick-fil-A's become kind of new age with the new stuff it's doing too, but you go in there and it's like a party. They got this crazy music on, and they got these wild menu items, and you feel like you're being transported to a street festival in New Orleans. And that's what people really love about Popeyes. And that's why I really hope it stays around now that Al Copeland's gone, and it continues to be such an interesting chain. So those are kind of the older chains that I wanted to talk about. And I feel a very personal connection to all three. Although I do probably like Popeyes and Chick-fil-A a little better than KFC. The other chains I wanted to talk about were a couple that were sort of upstarts. Well, I don't really know how much of an upstart Bojangles was, but I ate it all the time in North Carolina when I lived there, and that's where the chain's from, and now it's starting to go national. And what's very interesting about them is, of course, they make chicken, and of course they have all these different things with it, but they became famous because of their biscuits that they served with the chicken. So like your side's the most famous thing. It's very interesting. It's a very different take, And that's the thing that I think people need to understand about these fried chicken chains and why it's crazy. Is, you wouldn't think on the face of it that this many different ones could survive and being national money makers. But everybody has their own wrinkle. And that's what's great about the way fried chicken is made in the South in America, is it's possible for you all to have your own wrinkle and make a big national chain out of it. It's very cool, So because Bojangles is so famous for its biscuits, it originally became famous for like breakfast food, and then of course it served chicken, but now it's becoming a national chain, and that's the other thing all these chains had to go through when they became big, is they have to figure out how to start appealing to more people. They have to start throwing in different kinds of dishes, different kinds of sides and bowls, and KFC's always been experimenting things. I remember it came out with this weird thing when I was in college called the Double Down, where it was a sandwich, except instead of a sandwich, it was 2 fillets instead of a bun. It was pretty wild, and it was very bad for you. But in North Carolina, I do think while there's fried chicken there, and obviously Bojangles is a chain from there, a lot of people don't associate it with fried chicken like they do Kentucky or Georgia or Louisiana. So Bojangles has a lot of work on its hands to sort of building a reputation on that. And that's why it's easier for them to say, well, we got good biscuits and we also have chicken. So, and then the last one I wanted to talk about was one I ran across a lot when I was in college called Raisin Cane's, which is also from Louisiana, but it's from Baton Rouge and not New Orleans. And when we were in college, when I was in college at the University of Kentucky, it was right across the street practically from the main classroom building. So lots of people ate there all the time. And their thing, their nuance or wrinkle they brought to the game was that they had the best sauce. They made this sauce that just nobody else could recreate. And they didn't really serve a heck of a lot in their menu. It just came, you could just get like chicken, fries, toast, and coleslaw. That was it. But you could not find a sauce like this sauce, and people loved this sauce. And that was the wrinkle they brought to the game. I don't know how long that will sustain them or not, but, you know, they built a location in Lexington after being all the way out in Louisiana, so, you know, it's working. The model is working. Anyway, so that's what I know about sort of the main ones. There's a couple other ones that I've heard of. One's called Churches and others called Lee's, but I didn't really talk about them much in this podcast because, frankly, I don't know much about them. I just don't. So, yeah, tell me what you think. Tell me if you have any interesting stories of trying any of these places, you know, and what your impression of them is. And keep listening. Check out the Know Your Place podcast on SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/knowyourplacepodcast, all one word, or on Facebook at facebook.com/knowyourplacepodcast, all one word. And we will be coming soon to YouTube and iTunes, and maybe another social media platform near you. Special thanks to my wife, Sarah, and Jay Graff for the riff.